They say kings die with crowns on their heads and legacy in their veins. But what if a king didn't just die? What if he rotted alive, piece by putrid piece, while the world still bowed before him? If this kind of story grips you, if you crave the forgotten, the grotesque, and the chilling truths history tried to bury, then you're exactly where you need to be. Welcome to my channel. Subscribe now, so you never miss the moments that history would rather you forget. Because here, history doesn't whisper, it festers. The story does not begin with a battlefield or a coronation. It begins in a bedroom, dark, heavy with the scent of decay, the air thick with the weight of secrets. A king lies still in a vast canopied bed, draped in silks that no longer hide the truth. His body is bloated, the skin stretched and glistening. His servants avoid looking at him directly. They move quietly, their footsteps hushed, their faces pale. Outside, the people still call him Majesty. Inside, they call him something else, though only in whispers, the rotting king. This is not fiction. This is not folklore. This is a true story of a monarch whose body betrayed him while he still sat on the throne. A man of immense power, once praised for his virility and strength, now reduced to something monstrous, something unrecognizable. His flesh was failing him while his mind remained alert. He could issue orders, sign executions, and strike terror into courtiers with a single glance, all while his limbs swelled, blackened, and split. He was alive, and he was rotting. The cause of his condition was no great mystery to those close to him. Years of overindulgence had taken their toll. Rich foods, endless feasts, wine that flowed like water. His appetite was as legendary as his cruelty. He had grown massive, far beyond the limits of a man meant to move freely. Some said he weighed nearly 400 pounds. He had to be hoisted into bed with pulleys. His legs could no longer support his own body, and one in particular had become the epicenter of his suffering. A wound, old, deep, unhealed, festered for years. Some said it never closed. Others whispered that it leaked constantly, the stench making men gag. In the earliest days, the wound had been treated like any other royal affliction, with dignity, secrecy, and the finest physicians. But medicine in that age was more ritual than remedy. They lanced it, they cauterized it, they applied ointments made of herbs, wine, and even crushed pearls. Nothing worked. The leg remained swollen and hot, the skin stretched taut, turning colors it was never meant to be. Servants would find the bandages soaked through in the morning, sometimes with pus, sometimes with blood, sometimes with both. The king would howl in agony when touched, but refused to admit weakness. His chambers were kept warm, not for comfort, but to mask the smell. He continued to rule. That's the part people forget. That even as his flesh began to betray him, he issued commands, drafted laws, and sentenced men to death. He received ambassadors who bowed before a throne that reeked of disease. He smiled at them, his teeth stained with rot, his breath sour with infection. Some said he could barely keep his eyes open during meetings. Others claimed he was sharper than ever, rage sharpening his senses, turning suspicion into strategy. But no one dared to speak of what they saw beneath the robes, beneath the jewels, beneath the illusion of kingship. What made his condition so disturbing was not simply the rot. It was that the rot lingered. It didn't consume him all at once like the plague or a sword on the battlefield. It advanced slowly, deliberately, as if determined to keep him alive for as long as possible, as if whatever force drove this infection wanted him to feel every moment of it. His body didn't collapse. It unraveled, piece by piece, inch by inch. There were days when the king would scream through the night, the sound echoing through the palace halls. There were nights when no one dared enter his chamber for fear of what they might find or smell. And still, he ruled. There's a cruelty in that, too, that a man could sit upon a throne while his body turned against him and still hold the lives of others in his hands. That his suffering made him more dangerous, not less. Some said the pain made him paranoid, that he trusted no one, that he would wake from fevered dreams and demand the arrest of noblemen who had done nothing, that he accused his physicians of poisoning him, that he accused his own wife. Some were imprisoned, others were executed, and always the wound pulsed beneath him like a second heart, hot, foul, unstoppable. By now, the court had changed. Gone were the bright young things who once danced in his presence. They had been replaced by shadows, men and women who spoke in whispers, who bowed too deeply, who smiled too often. They lived in fear, not of war or politics, but of the man rotting on the throne. Some refused to enter the king's chamber at all. Letters sent home by foreign envoys spoke of the smell. One described it as a fog of the dead. Another simply wrote, "He is no longer human." But the king still signed decrees, still dictated terms, still executed rivals. His signature, though shaky, remained law. His voice, though hoarse, commanded obedience. And perhaps that was the most terrifying thing of all, that the kingdom still bowed, that the machine of monarchy still moved, that no matter how ruined the man had become, the myth endured, because kings do not rot, not in stories, not in paintings, but in real life they do. In public, the king remained a symbol, cloaked in gold-threaded robes, draped in jewels, and seated on an ornate throne. He looked every bit the monarch that poets once praised and painters glorified. But that image was an illusion, one so fragile it could shatter with a single whiff of the truth. Behind the pomp and ritual, behind the towering walls of his castle, he was a man being devoured from the inside out. The infection in his leg worsened. No longer just a wound. It had become a cavern of rot, a festering abyss hidden beneath bandages that could no longer contain the stench. The skin around it turned purple, then black. Gangrene had set in. The leg was hot to the touch and pulsated with its own rhythm, as if something alive had made a home within it. At night, attendants heard him mutter through his teeth prayers, curses, names of people long dead. Some believed the leg had become cursed. Others said it was divine punishment. But no one said it aloud. Speaking of the king's condition was treason. Smelling it was inevitable. His doctors were helpless. They suggested amputation, then quickly retracted it. Removing the leg might have killed him instantly. Keeping it, they feared, was simply killing him slowly. But the king refused all talk of weakness. He demanded that he still be treated like a god on earth. And so they fed him lies. They praised his strength. They told him he looked healthier by the day. He knew they were lying. He didn't care, as long as they lied well. Those closest to him, advisors, wives, body servants, became prisoners of proximity. The closer they were to the king, the more danger they were in. His mood shifted like storms. One moment, he wept with gratitude for a gesture of kindness. The next, he screamed accusations of betrayal. His paranoia fermented in the fevered dreams of his long nights. He heard plots and footsteps. He saw rebellion in sideways glances. One of his trusted aides was dragged away in chains because the king had dreamt that he poisoned the royal wine. The man was executed the next day. Dreams, it seemed, carried the weight of law. Meanwhile, the king's physical needs grew increasingly grotesque. He could no longer relieve himself without assistance. A special contraption was built beneath his throne, a cushioned toilet of carved oak, designed to keep his dignity while hiding his decay. Attendants trained in silence and obedience managed the process. They did not speak. They did not flinch. But they did not sleep well, either. The rot spread, not just through his body, but through the palace itself. The stench permeated the tapestries. Candles burned day and night, not for light, but for concealment. Perfumes were sprayed in clouds. Incense burned until the walls were stained with soot. But the human nose knows. Visitors left early. Foreign envoys shortened their stays. When asked what they remembered most about their royal audience, one simply replied, the smell and the silence. And yet, his enemies remained silent, because despite the deterioration, he still ruled. His word was law. His signature still carried the weight of execution. His illness, paradoxically, made him more feared than ever. Those who might have plotted against him waited, not because they respected him, but because they feared his last acts would be the most violent. What does a dying tyrant care for restraint? He knew the end was near. That gave him license. In those final months, the executions grew more frequent. He beheaded a friend. He imprisoned a nephew. He turned his court into a graveyard. There were whispers that he enjoyed the death, that he took pleasure in watching those around him tremble, that the rot wasn't just in his leg, it was in his soul, that it had spread from the wound to his mind to the very structure of the realm. Servants began to say prayers before entering his room. Some wore crosses beneath their uniforms. One reportedly carved protective symbols into the wood of his bedposts, not to protect the king, but to protect themselves. His palace became a mausoleum in waiting. Curtains remained drawn. Mirrors were covered. Music ceased. There were no more feasts, no more balls, no more laughter. Even the jesters stopped performing. It was as if joy itself had been banished. The only sounds were whispers and weeping and the king's labored breathing echoing through the walls. Still, he clung to life, as if through sheer force of will. He refused to die. Doctors said he should have been dead months ago. Priests offered to read last rites, only to be thrown out of the chamber. He spat at their robes, cursed their faith, demanded they return when he summoned them. Not before. He would not go quietly. He would not go gently. He would go only on his terms. But death, like rot, is patient, and it was waiting. Winter pressed hard against the stone walls of the palace, but inside the royal chambers, it was always warm, too warm. The fire burned day and night, not for comfort, but to keep the king's infected body from freezing, and more importantly, to keep the rot from spreading faster. But nothing could stop the smell. It had become unbearable. No amount of rose water or burning herbs could cover the scent of a body collapsing inward. Those who entered his presence did so quickly and left with their heads bowed, fighting nausea. Some swore the king was already dead, and that the thing on the throne was only a puppet of flesh, propped up by fear and delusion. By this time, his face was a pale gray. The flesh beneath his eyes hung like melting wax. His lips cracked and bled, his hands trembled, and his eyes, one so full of fire, looked clouded, glassy. The fever came in waves now, scorching him from the inside, driving him to bouts of delirium that made even his closest attendants shudder. He called out to dead wives, to children he had disowned, to servants long executed. He wept openly for hours, then would fly into sudden rages, demanding the execution of imagined conspirators. The court didn't know which was more terrifying, his agony or his lucidity. And still, somehow he issued commands, signed documents, held counsel. His handwriting had become a violent sprawl of lines and ink, but no one questioned it. The officials around him kept the machine of monarchy running, pretending the king was still in control, pretending he was still king. But they all knew the truth. They were watching the corpse continue to reign. Outside the court, rumors spread like wildfire. The people spoke of the rot as a divine punishment. They whispered that he was being eaten alive for his sins. Some claimed he had made a pact with the devil, and that his body was paying the price. Others said he was cursed, by a wife, by a priest, by the hundreds of souls he'd sentenced to death. One midwife, overhearing court gossip, told her village that the king's leg was so full of pus it had burst like an overripe fruit. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The myth was forming. The people no longer saw a king. They saw a monster, crumbling from the inside out. The medical accounts from this period are few, mostly destroyed or hidden. But fragments remain. Letters between doctors reveal attempts at drainage, surgeries without anesthesia, horrifying tools used to cut away the decaying flesh. None of it worked. The infection always returned. Worse, stronger, more aggressive. It was as if his body refused to heal. Or more chillingly, as if it couldn't heal. As if the rot was no longer biological, but something else, something deeper. Some attendants began to dream of the king. Nightmares of him rising from his bed, swollen and dripping, walking the halls while everyone slept. One chambermaid refused to return to her post after seeing his exposed leg during a dressing. She collapsed, screamed that he was no longer human. Her body was found in the garden weeks later. She had thrown herself into the river. The royal court dismissed it as hysteria. But among the lower servants, stories spread quickly. They said the king was cursed, that he was transforming, that the rot was consuming not just his flesh, but something eternal. And yet, no one acted. No one stopped him. Power clung to his broken form. like a crown fused to bone. Even in his worst condition, no one dared speak of succession. His advisors feared being named traitors. His heirs kept their distance. His enemies waited, biting their tongues, hoping that soon, very soon, the rot would finish its work. The days grew longer, his breath more ragged. The infection spread from his leg to his lower abdomen. He could no longer sit upright for long periods. He screamed constantly. His bed was soaked in blood and fluid. His pillows had to be burned daily. His chamber reeked of decay. His flesh split open in places. Maggots were rumored to have appeared. Some say they were seen crawling across his sheets. Whether that is true or not, no one denied that death had already entered the room. Still, the king resisted. Every time the priest came to perform last rites, he would shout and spit and send them away. He insisted he was not dying. He promised campaigns. He demanded celebrations. He dictated letters to foreign rulers, boasting a strength he no longer possessed. Those around him humored him, not because they believed, but because they feared the consequences of honesty. This was a man who had ruled through fear for decades, who had commanded armies, dissolved marriages, broken churches, a man who had executed close friends and blood relatives without blinking. And now, he was powerless to stop the slow undoing of his own body. The paradox of his final weeks was unbearable. A king whose reach had once shaped nations now reduced the flesh that betrayed him, breath by breath, day by day. And yet it went on. There came a moment, sometime during the last days, when even the most loyal could no longer pretend. The king was dying, not as a man of dignity, nor as a figure of reverence, but as something unrecognizable. He no longer resembled a human being. His body had ballooned with fluid. His skin split at the joints. His torso was blistered, oozing and inflamed. His mouth foamed. His eyes rolled back. He moaned when touched. His very presence terrified even those who had once called him a friend. The palace was locked in unnatural silence. The usual rhythms of royal life had stopped. No music, no messengers, no hunting horns, just candlelight and whispers. Those who were tasked with staying by his side spoke only when necessary. They did not look directly at him. Some wept quietly. Others simply prayed. But all knew that something dark, something more than death, had taken root in that room. It wasn't just the smell anymore. It was a feeling. The temperature, the air in his chamber had grown thick, humid, oppressive, like a tomb sealed too long. Those who entered found it difficult to breathe. Some felt faint. Many said they heard things. Distant whispers, soft scratching behind the walls, footsteps that didn't belong to any living man. A few claimed that when the king slept, if he ever truly slept, his mouth moved, as if speaking to something unseen, not in prayer, but in conversation. The final attendants were chosen carefully, only the most discreet, only the most loyal. Even they couldn't hide their horror. His screams echoed throughout the nights, so loud and persistent that some guests thought wild animals had breached the palace walls. One physician kept a journal. He described a moment when the king's abdomen had swelled so violently that his nightshirt split open. The wound beneath was green and yellow, bubbling with something no one could name. That doctor left the palace the next day. He never returned. Despite everything, the king still refused last rites. He shouted obscenities at the clergy. He declared that he would recover, that he would ride again, that he would lead an army, build a cathedral, live to 100. But his voice was raw, broken, nearly unintelligible. His body shook as he spoke. Blood stained his teeth. The rot had reached his internal organs. It was no longer just his leg. It was everywhere. The physicians stopped pretending. They now worked not to heal him, but to mask the inevitable. They packed his wounds with herbs and cloth. They poured wine down his throat, hoping the alcohol would dull the agony. They cut and drained what they could, but it made no difference. The infection returned stronger each time, as if mocking their efforts. One nurse whispered that she had seen the rot move, crawl, beneath the skin, as if it had a mind of its own. On one occasion, his body convulsed so violently that the attendants thought he had died. They called in the clergy. The court braced for the announcement. But then he breathed, gasping like a man drowning. He opened his eyes and muttered something none of them could understand. They would later say that the look on his face was not relief, nor pain, nor even rage. It was terror, pure, unfiltered fear. There were rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, that during these last hours, the king began to speak in tongues, that he called out to figures long dead, that he saw things in the corners of the room, that he begged unseen figures for forgiveness, that he screamed that they were dragging him down. One chamberlain fainted after hearing a midnight cry from the king's room, "Get them off me!" followed by a crashing sound and silence. No one knew what to do. There was no precedent. Kings had died before, but none like this. None who decayed while alive. None whose death felt less like the closing of a chapter and more like fulfillment of a curse. The very walls of the palace seemed to lean in. The torches flickered low, and beyond the windows, the wind howled like a chorus of the damned. Some began to believe the king could not die, that whatever punishment he was enduring was not meant to end, that he had become an eternal monument to his own cruelty. Those who feared God prayed. Those who feared nothing still kept their distance. Even his closest allies stopped entering his chamber alone. And then, after days of pain, terror, hallucination, and rot, it began to stop. His breathing slowed. His screaming ceased. His eyes fluttered shut. The room grew quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a storm so violent it leaves nothing standing. The courtiers waited. The doctors waited. The guard stood motionless outside the door. No bell rang. No priest was summoned. No one dared make the call. The body still twitched. The wound still leaked. His mouth still moved, though no sound came out. And still they waited, because no one wanted to be the one to say it, that the king had finally rotted to death. In the end, there was no grand announcement, no final words etched in gold, no glorious farewell, just silence and the slow, quiet task of removing the body. The palace staff moved carefully, with gloves, cloth, and averted eyes. They wrapped what was left of the king in heavy linen soaked in spices, but the smell still clung to everything. The death of a monarch should have been marked with ceremony, but in this case, it was marked with sigh of relief. Those who prepared the body worked in darkness. The rot had bloated his form beyond recognition. Some said the skin had split during transport. Others whispered that the coffin had to be sealed with pitch to keep the fluids in. There were murmurs, soft, reluctant murmurs, that the body had burst open during the night. Whether true or not, no one argued. No one wanted to know. He was buried quickly, not in silence, but not in song either. His tomb, grand as it was, could not conceal the legacy of his final days. The rot lingered in the walls and the halls, in the memories of all who had seen him. Even those who had once adored him now walked with haunted eyes. The myth of the great king was over, replaced by a far more disturbing truth. And yet people still bowed. They still knelt before his image in paintings. They spoke of him in awe, repeating the stories that made him legend. But they left out the screams, the smell, the madness. They left out the rot. Because history sanitizes. It polishes. It hides the truth beneath layers of gold and glory. We remember what others erased. We speak what others buried. We show you the horror beneath the crown.